Tragedy breaks the human soul. Horror is what crawls into the cracks. Welcome to Wicked Files. A house does not simply inherit the sins of its builder. It incubates them in the dark, starving, until a new family arrives to feed the rot. The fog rolling through the dense, suffocating pine forests of the Cascade Mountains did not behave like natural weather. It moved like a living, breathing predator, swallowing the winding mountain roads and choking the sunlight until the world was reduced to a bruised, oppressive gray. We had driven 3 hours deep into the isolated Washington wilderness, chasing a desperate dream. My husband, Arthur, was a man consumed by the need to provide. After 2 grueling years of financial struggle in Seattle, he had become obsessed with the idea of a fresh start, a grand estate where our 10-year-old son, Thomas, and our 6-year-old daughter, Lily, could grow up surrounded by nature. That obsession led us to the rusted, towering iron gates of Blackwood Manor. The estate was a sprawling, Gothic Victorian monstrosity built of black timber and gray stone, looming at the edge of a jagged cliff overlooking the valley. It was breathtakingly massive, but as I stepped out of our station wagon into the freezing mountain air, an immediate visceral wave of absolute dread crashed into my chest. The house didn't look peaceful. It looked like a rotting tooth jutting out of the earth. Mr. Gable, the nervous, chain-smoking real estate agent, was pacing nervously by the front steps. He refused to actually look directly at the windows. "The deed is completely cleared, Arthur," Gable muttered, pulling his trench coat tight against the bitter wind. "The bank is highly motivated to offload the property. You're getting 4,000 square feet, 3 acres of timber, and a carriage house. For 30% below market value," I interrupted, my voice trembling as I pulled my heavy wool cardigan tightly around my shoulders. I looked directly at Gable. "Nobody discounts a functional property by 30% in this county, Mr. Gable. There are 3 dozen abandoned houses on this mountain. Why is this one so cheap? What is the catch?" Gable swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the freezing sweat from his forehead. It's just local superstition, Evelyn. A stigma, nothing more." "What kind of stigma?" I demanded, planting my feet on the gravel. "Tell me right now, or we are getting back in the car." Gable sighed, looking at his expensive leather shoes. "Years ago, there was an incident, a family tragedy. The original builder of this manor, he died inside the house. And then, a few years later, a violent altercation occurred with the subsequent tenants. A murder, the locals talk. Once a house gets a reputation in a small mountain town, the bank can't give it away." My blood instantly turned to ice. "A murder," I gasped, instinctively taking a step backward toward the car. "Arthur, no, absolutely not. We cannot live in a house where someone was slaughtered. We are leaving." I grabbed Arthur's arm, expecting him to share my absolute horror. But when I looked at my husband's face, my stomach violently dropped. Arthur wasn't horrified. He was smiling. It wasn't his warm, usual smile. It was a rigid, unnerving, almost mechanical grin. His eyes were wide, completely fixated on the towering black timber of the manor, completely ignoring my panic. "People die everywhere, Evelyn," Arthur said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual warmth. "In hospitals, in apartments, in the streets. Does that mean we stop living in them? It's just wood and stone. I can fix this place. I will completely renovate the interior. I'll paint the walls. I will build a beautiful, massive home for Thomas and Lily. Arthur, please," I begged, my fingers digging into his coat. "Listen to your gut. Look at this place. feels wrong." He finally turned to look at me, and for a fraction of a second, I didn't recognize the man staring back. "We are buying it, Evelyn. Trust me. We will never find a house this grand for this price again. Our future is inside those walls." I should have fought him harder. I should have thrown the kids in the car and driven back to Seattle. But seeing the desperate, unwavering obsession in his eyes, I completely caved. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I convinced myself that my husband knew best. We signed the closing papers right there on the hood of the car, completely unaware that we had just signed our own death warrants. Moving day was a chaotic, exhausting blur of heavy cardboard boxes and creaking floorboards. The interior of Blackwood Manor was heavily shadowed, smelling deeply of old dust, dried lavender, and a faint metallic scent of copper that I could never quite scrub out of the air. Lily was ecstatic. Unbothered by the heavy, oppressive architecture, she immediately ran up the grand mahogany staircase to claim the largest bedroom at the end of the long, narrow corridor. Hours later, as the sun began to bleed out behind the tree line, plunging the manor into deep, suffocating shadows, I carried a box of winter clothes up to Lily's new room. I stopped dead in the doorway. The heavy oak door was pushed open. The room was freezing, the ambient temperature at least 20 degrees colder than the hallway. Lily was sitting cross-legged in the center of the hardwood floor, surrounded by her scattered toys. But she wasn't playing. She was staring directly into the empty, pitch-black corner of the room, nodding her head as if listening to a fascinating story. "I have a dollhouse too," Lily whispered into the empty air, her voice carrying an eerie, hollow echo in the massive room. "But my daddy says we can't play with it until he unpacks it. We can share it if you want." A cold spike of adrenaline pierced my chest. "Lily? Who are you talking to?" "Sweetheart." Lily slowly turned her head to look at me, her young, innocent face entirely calm. "My new friend, Mommy. Her name is Abigail. She lives here." I stepped into the room, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I looked directly into the dark corner. There was absolutely nothing there, just peeling floral wallpaper and heavy, creeping shadows. "There's nobody there, Lily?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady, masking the profound terror bubbling in my gut. "You're just playing pretend." "No, I'm not," Lily replied firmly, pointing a small finger directly at the empty space. "She's standing right there, Mommy. She says we shouldn't be here. She says the angry man is going to wake up." I didn't argue. I didn't want to hear another word. I grabbed Lily by the hand, hauled her off the floor, and marched her downstairs to the brightly lit kitchen, trying desperately to convince myself it was just the overactive imagination of a child adjusting to a creepy new house. But Blackwood Manor wasn't just creepy. It was actively malevolent. And that night, the house set its sights entirely on the mind of my husband. Around 3 a.m., the wind howling off the mountain peaks sounded like the deafening shrieks of tortured animals. I was lying in the massive master bedroom, staring at the cracked plaster on the ceiling, unable to sleep. The silence in the house beneath the wind was unnatural. It felt heavy, expectant, like the air right before a violent lightning strike. Suddenly, Arthur began to thrash violently beside me. He didn't just toss and turn. His entire body convulsed. He was violently kicking the heavy quilts, his fists tightly clenched, his jaw locked in a painful, grinding grimace. "Arthur," I whispered, reaching out to touch his shoulder. His skin was boiling. He was radiating an impossible, blistering heat, completely soaked in a thick layer of feverish sweat. Then the whispers started. At first, I thought the wind was rattling the window panes. But as I leaned closer to Arthur, I realized the sound was coming from him. But it wasn't his voice. It sounded like three distinct, overlapping, guttural voices whispering directly into the dark air of the bedroom, utilizing my husband's vocal cords to project their malice. "Kill them," the overlapping voices hissed, vibrating with a deep, mechanical hatred. "Finish them off. Put them in the dirt. End it. End it now. Arthur, wake up!" I screamed, violently shaking his shoulders, absolutely terrified by the demonic cadence pouring out of his mouth. Arthur's eyes snapped open. They were completely bloodshot, wide with a blinding primal terror. He shot up in bed, gasping for air as if he had been held underwater for 10 minutes. He didn't look at me. He threw his arm out, pointing a trembling finger directly at the foot of our bed. "Look at him!" Arthur shrieked, his voice cracking, tearing his own hair with his free hand. "Evelyn, look at him. He's standing right there." I scrambled backward against the headboard, pulling my knees to my chest, my eyes darting frantically in the dark. I squinted into the heavy shadows at the foot of the bed. There was nothing. The room was completely empty. "There's no one there, Arthur. You're having a nightmare," I cried, trying to grab his flailing hands. "You have a massive fever." "He's right there," Arthur roared, completely ignoring me, his eyes tracking an invisible, towering entity moving across the room. "He's telling me to do it. Make him stop. Evelyn, make him stop screaming in my head." He collapsed forward, burying his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The fever was literally burning his mind alive. I held him as he wept, desperately trying to convince myself that this was just a severe viral infection, a horrific reaction to the stress of the move. I told myself that the morning light would banish the shadows, and my strong, loving husband would return to me. But as I held him in the dark, feeling the unnatural heat radiating from his bones, the temperature in the bedroom suddenly plummeted. The heavy, metallic stench of old blood and copper slowly flooded the room. I looked over Arthur's trembling shoulder, staring into the dark corner of the bedroom, and for a single agonizing second, I swore I saw the towering silhouette of a man with a crushed skull smiling back at me. The illusion of safety in Blackwood Manor did not even last a full 24 hours. By the following evening, a suffocating, heavy tension had settled over the house like a thick wool blanket. The fever that had ravaged Arthur the previous night seemed to have broken, but it took something fundamental away with it. He was physically present at the massive oak dining table, but his eyes were completely hollow, staring blankly at the floral wallpaper. He hadn't touched his food. 10-year-old Thomas, completely oblivious to the horrific, unseen currents swirling around his father, was simply being a child. He was quietly driving a small die-cast metal car across the edge of the dining table, making soft, rhythmic humming noises. "Thomas, eat your dinner, please," I said gently, cutting a piece of chicken for Lily. Thomas nodded, but the metal car slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly against his porcelain plate. It was a small, insignificant sound, but in the oppressive silence of the dining room, it echoed like a gunshot. Arthur's head snapped toward Thomas with terrifying, mechanical speed. His neck cracked loudly in the quiet room. His eyes were entirely dilated, completely swallowing the blue irises in a sea of absolute, bottomless black. The veins in his neck were bulging against his skin, pulsing rapidly. "Finish them," a guttural, overlapping whisper hissed from Arthur's lips. It wasn't his voice. It sounded like grinding stones. "They are bleeding you dry. End them. Arthur, I asked, my heart instantly dropping into my stomach. What did you just say? He didn't answer me. Arthur violently shoved his heavy wooden chair backward, crashed to the floor, splintering the legs. He lunged across the dining table, completely ignoring the plates and glasses shattering onto the hardwood, and grabbed Thomas by the collar of his shirt. Dad, stop. You're hurting me, Thomas screamed, his small hands desperately clawing at Arthur's massive, vice-like grip. Arthur, let him go, I shrieked, vaulting over the table and grabbing my husband's arm. His skin was freezing cold, completely devoid of human warmth. He possessed an unnatural, demonic strength that I could not even begin to fight. He swatted me away with the back of his hand, sending me crashing hard into the china cabinet. Glass shattered around me as I slumped to the floor, gasping for air. Arthur dragged Thomas down the long, shadowed hallway toward the foyer. The boy was weeping hysterically, his heels dragging against the floorboards. You need to learn quiet, Arthur roared, the overlapping, metallic voices bleeding heavily into his own. You need to learn the dark. He threw open the heavy oak door of the deep storage closet beneath the main staircase. It was a pitch-black, windowless space that smelled of rotting cedar and dead spiders. He violently shoved our weeping son inside and slammed the heavy door shut, instantly throwing the deadbolt lock. Arthur, no, please, I sobbed, crawling down the hallway, my ribs screaming in agony. He's terrified of the dark. Unlock the door. From inside the closet, Thomas was frantically pounding his small fists against the thick wood, shrieking in absolute, primal terror. Arthur stood in front of the door like a rigid, soulless sentinel. He didn't blink. He just stared down at me with those bottomless black eyes. He needs to be punished. The master of the house demands quiet. You are a monster, I screamed, throwing myself at his legs, desperately trying to claw my way up to the deadbolt. For 3 agonizing minutes, Thomas screamed in the dark. And then, as suddenly as the demonic rage had possessed him, the rigid tension in Arthur's body completely collapsed. He staggered backward, gasping violently, holding his hands up to his face as if he had just woken from a waking nightmare. He looked at the locked door, looked at my weeping, bruised face on the floor, and a profound, shattering horror washed over him. He threw the deadbolt open and ripped the door back. Thomas collapsed into my arms, hyperventilating, completely soaked in terrified sweat. Arthur backed away from us, his chest heaving. He fell to his knees in the center of the foyer, pressing the heels of his hands directly into his eye sockets, sobbing with a broken, pathetic desperation. Oh my God, Evelyn, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to do it, Arthur wept, rocking back and forth on the floorboards. I couldn't stop it. It's like my hands weren't my own. There are voices, Evie, thousands of voices crawling inside my skull. They are screaming at me to hurt you. I feel like I am going completely insane. I held my traumatized son tightly against my chest, staring at the broken shell of the man I loved. I wanted to pack the car that very second. I wanted to flee into the night. But looking at Arthur weeping on the floor, my logic violently warred with my terror. He wasn't a monster. He was sick. He was suffering from a catastrophic, stress-induced psychotic break. The pressure of the move, the finances, the new job at the Seattle architecture firm, it had completely fractured his mind. It's the stress, Arthur, I lied, my voice shaking as I tried to convince myself as much as him. You are just burnt out. Tomorrow is your massive investment presentation for the firm. You go into the city, you do the presentation, and then you take a leave of absence. We will get you a doctor." He nodded frantically, desperate to believe that a medical diagnosis could explain the rotting, violent darkness invading his mind. But there was no medical cure for Blackwood Manor. The next afternoon, the house was suffocatingly quiet. I had kept the children home from school, locking us in the living room while we waited for Arthur to return from his presentation in Seattle. At 2 p.m., the yellow rotary phone on the kitchen wall violently rang. I picked up the heavy receiver. "Hello, Evelyn, it's Richard Vance," the voice on the other end said. It was Arthur's senior partner at the firm. His tone wasn't professional. It was laced with absolute, unadulterated shock. "Evelyn, is Arthur at home?" "No, he hasn't returned yet." "How did the presentation go?" I asked, a knot of pure dread tightening in my throat. "Evelyn, Arthur didn't give the presentation," Richard said quietly. He stood up in the middle of the boardroom, right in front of the primary investors. He stared at the wall for 3 minutes in dead silence. And then, "Evelyn, he lost his mind." He grabbed a heavy glass carafe and shattered it against the mahogany table. He started screaming at the board. He kept shouting, "I'll finish you all. I will put you in the dirt." He sounded possessed. "Evelyn." Security had to physically tackle him to the floor. We fired him on the spot. He was escorted to his car 20 minutes ago. The phone slipped from my sweaty fingers, dangling by its coiled cord, emitting a hollow dial tone. "Mom!" I spun around. Thomas was standing in the kitchen doorway, looking confused. "If Dad is at work, who is supposed to pick me up from the bus stop at the bottom of the mountain?" My heart completely stopped. In the chaos of the morning, I had forgotten to cancel Thomas's afternoon bus route. I had kept him home, but the school bus still ran its scheduled drop-off at the base of the mountain road. If Arthur was driving back from the city, completely consumed by the demonic rage that got him fired, he would pass that exact bus stop. "Get your coat, Thomas. Right now," I screamed, grabbing my car keys from the counter. Before we could reach the front door, the heavy crunch of gravel echoed from the driveway. I peered through the sheer curtains of the living room window. Arthur's station wagon was parked erratically across the lawn, the headlights blazing in the foggy afternoon. The car was completely coated in thick, wet mud, right up to the windows. Arthur stepped out of the driver's side. He didn't look toward the house. He moved with that terrifying, rigid, mechanical stiffness. He slowly walked toward the heavy iron gates of the property, staring into the dense, fog-choked timber. I threw the front door open and sprinted to the passenger side of the car, violently yanking the door open. "Evelyn, is that you?" I gasped. Sitting in the passenger seat, shaking like a leaf, was not Thomas, but our neighbor's teenage son, Michael, who rode the same bus route. "Michael, what happened? Why are you in Arthur's car? Where did he take you?" I demanded, grabbing his shoulders. "Mrs. Evelyn, Mr. Arthur is crazy." Michael sobbed, his eyes wide with absolute horror. "He was at the bus stop. He told me to get in. But he didn't drive up the mountain. He took the old, abandoned logging road, the one that ends at the Black Creek Ravine. He parked the car right at the edge of the 50-foot drop-off." "Oh my God," I whispered, the blood draining completely from my face. "He just sat there, Mrs. Evelyn," Michael cried, hyperventilating. He stared over the cliff into the black water. He kept talking to the empty passenger seat. He kept saying, "They make me weak. I have to silence them." I thought he was going to drive us off the cliff. I started screaming, and he suddenly just snapped out of it, threw the car in reverse, and sped back here. "You have to call the police." I dragged Michael out of the car, sent him running up the road to his own house, and locked Thomas and Lily in the upstairs bathroom, barricading the door with a heavy wooden dresser. I walked slowly back down the grand mahogany staircase. The interior of the house was rapidly darkening as the evening fog blocked out the sun. Arthur was standing in the center of the living room. He hadn't turned on the lights. He was completely engulfed in the heavy, oppressive shadows. His tie was ripped. His dress shirt was stained with mud and sweat. He was standing perfectly still, staring at the blank wall above the fireplace. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. "Arthur?" I said, my voice trembling, trying to project a courage I absolutely did not feel. "You terrified that boy. You lost your job. Look at me." Arthur didn't turn around. The air in the living room grew freezing cold. The heavy scent of copper and rotting timber flooded my lungs. "They don't understand." The demonic, overlapping voice hissed from Arthur's mouth, echoing loudly against the high ceilings. "Who doesn't understand, Arthur?" I asked, gripping the wooden banister so hard my knuckles turned white. Slowly, agonizingly, Arthur turned his head to look at me. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated evil. The man I married was completely gone, swallowed whole by the rotting entity that owned this house. His jaw hung open at an unnatural, slack angle. "She is the anchor," the voices whispered, vibrating in the freezing air. "The wife makes you weak. Her love is a chain. You cannot be the master of this house while she breathes. Silence her." Arthur's whole body pivoted toward me, his hands curled into rigid, bone-crushing fists. "I bought this house," Arthur roared, his voice booming with a terrifying, supernatural volume that shook the crystal chandelier above my head. "It is mine, and you are ruining my dream. I will kill you, Evelyn. I will slaughter every single person in this house until it is quiet." He lunged across the living room, his heavy boots thundering against the floorboards, coming to tear me apart. I didn't freeze, as Arthur's massive, heavy frame lunged across the living room, his hands outstretched to snap my neck. Pure maternal survival instinct hijacked my nervous system. I dove hard to the right, rolling across the Persian rug just as Arthur crashed into the heavy wooden coffee table where I had been standing a fraction of a second before. The wood splintered under his immense weight. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the heavy, solid brass fireplace poker from the hearth. As Arthur roared and scrambled up to grab my ankle, I swung the heavy iron rod with every single ounce of strength in my body, bringing it down viciously across his kneecap. A sickening crack echoed through the room. Arthur collapsed with a guttural, demonic shriek, clutching his knee. It didn't stop him, but it bought me the 5 seconds I desperately needed. I sprinted up the grand mahogany staircase, my lungs burning, slipping on the hardwood in my socks. I reached the upstairs bathroom and violently shoved the heavy wooden dresser away from the door. "Thomas! Lily! Right now!" I screamed, grabbing them both by the arms. I dragged my terrified, weeping children down the dark corridor and shoved them into the massive master bedroom. I slammed the heavy oak door shut, threw the brass deadbolt, and shoved the heavy vanity desk in front of it. We were trapped. We were on the second floor, and the drop from the window to the rocky cliffside below was a guaranteed death sentence. Lily was sitting on the floor, clutching her knees to her chest, but she wasn't looking at the barricaded door. She was staring directly into the pitch-black corner of the bedroom. "Abigail is crying, Mommy?" Lily whimpered, her tiny voice trembling violently. She says the angry man is awake. She says he is wearing daddy like a coat. Lily, stop it, please, I sobbed, frantically pacing the room, looking for a weapon. She's right there, Mommy, Lily insisted, pointing a shaking finger into the dark. Abigail says the man who built the house wants us dead. She says that's what happened to her. Her daddy got angry, and the builder made him use the axe. A wave of absolute, paralyzing ice crashed over my brain. I remembered Mr. Gable's terrified, sweaty face at the front gate. The original builder died inside the house. A few years later, a murder. I lunged for the yellow rotary phone sitting on the bedside table. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely dial the numbers. I pulled the crumpled real estate agency card from my pocket and dialed Mr. Gable's emergency home line. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up. "Hello, Gable, you son of a bitch," I shrieked, the panic completely fracturing my voice. "My husband is trying to slaughter us. What is in this house? Tell me right now, or I swear to God I will drag you down to hell with me." There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Gable's ragged breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was broken, laced with absolute, profound guilt. "His name was Elias Blackwood," Gable whispered, his voice trembling. "He built the manor in the 20s. He poured his entire soul, his entire fortune into that house. But the Great Depression wiped him out. The bank was coming to foreclose. Elias was a proud, bitter, violent man. The night before the bank seized the property, he suffered a massive stroke in the parlor. He died slowly, paralyzed on the floor, completely consumed by unfulfilled greed and a blinding, suffocating hatred for the world. What does he want with Arthur?" I screamed, watching the heavy oak door begin to rattle as heavy, dragging footsteps approached in the hallway. "Elias didn't leave the manor, Evelyn," Gable wept. "His spirit is a parasite. It's a completely malignant, frustrated entity. He despises families because they bring life into the halls he died in. He possesses the patriarch of the house. He infects the father's mind, driving them into a state of absolute, paranoid psychosis. He forces the father to slaughter his own wife and children, and then forces him to end his own life, ensuring the house remains completely empty. That is what happened to the last tenants, a little girl named Abigail. Her father murdered the entire family before hanging himself in the carriage house. You sold us a slaughterhouse, I roared. I'm sorry. The bank forced my hand. Gable sobbed. Evelyn, you have to get out of there. Elias has full control. He will not stop until... The phone line went dead with a loud, aggressive snap. From the hallway, a deafening, terrifying silence fell over the bedroom door. Arthur, I gasped, stepping back, pulling Thomas and Lily tightly against my legs. There is no Arthur. The booming, overlapping, demonic voice echoed from the other side of the heavy oak wood. This is my house, and no one leaves this house alive. Thwack, the blade of a heavy, rusted wood-splitting axe violently exploded through the center of the oak door, sending jagged splinters of wood flying across the bedroom carpet. Thomas and Lily shrieked in absolute terror. Thwack, the axe tore through the wood again, completely severing the brass deadbolt lock. The vanity desk I had used as a barricade was violently shoved backward across the hardwood floor with the screeching sound of tearing wood. The door swung wide open. Arthur stood in the doorway, completely engulfed in the shadows. He was holding the heavy logging axe with both hands. His eyes were entirely black, weeping thick, dark tears of blood that stained his pale cheeks. The entity inside of him was pushing his physical body far beyond its natural limits, tearing his muscles to fuel the demonic strength. "Daddy, please," Thomas screamed, dropping to his knees, begging the monster wearing his father's face. Arthur didn't blink. He raised the heavy axe high above his head, the rusted metal gleaming in the pale moonlight bleeding through the window, and stepped into the room, locking his dead eyes entirely on my 10-year-old son. "No!" I roared. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I launched my entire body forward with a feral, primal ferocity, tackling Arthur directly around his waist. The sheer force of my momentum knocked him off balance. We crashed violently onto the hardwood floor. The heavy axe slipped from his hands, sliding across the room and clattering against the baseboards. Arthur roared, a deafening, unnatural sound of pure malice, and violently backhanded me across the face. My vision flashed white. The taste of hot copper flooded my mouth. I scrambled backward as Arthur grabbed my throat with both hands, pinning me to the floor, his freezing, bone-crushing grip completely cutting off my oxygen. "I will break your neck, and then I will split them in half." The demonic voice hissed directly into my face, the putrid stench of rotting timber pouring from Arthur's mouth. "Mom!" Thomas screamed. Black spots danced violently across my vision. I was suffocating. I reached out blindly, my hands desperately sweeping the floorboards around me. My fingers brushed against the heavy, solid brass base of the bedside lamp that had been knocked over in the struggle. I gripped the brass stem with both hands. I pulled it back, fighting the fading darkness in my mind, and swung it forward with every single ounce of adrenaline left in my burning muscles. The heavy brass base collided directly with Arthur's temple with a sickening, wet crunch. The demonic entity shrieked in shock. The physical brain of my husband simply could not withstand the blunt force trauma. Arthur's completely black eyes rolled back into his skull. His grip instantly vanished from my throat. He collapsed sideways, hitting the floorboards like a sack of wet cement, completely unconscious, a thick pool of dark blood beginning to form beneath his head. I rolled over, violently gasping for air, coughing up blood onto the carpet. "Thomas, Lily, grab my hands." I choked out, stumbling to my feet. I grabbed my weeping children and dragged them over Arthur's unconscious body. I didn't look back. We sprinted down the dark, twisting hallway, flew down the grand mahogany staircase, and burst through the heavy front doors into the freezing, absolute pitch blackness of the mountain fog. We didn't stop running until we reached the bottom of the mountain road, where a passing logging truck nearly hit us before slamming on its air brakes. The police arrived at Blackwood Manor 3 hours later as the sun began to rise. They found Arthur exactly where I left him, lying in a pool of his own blood. He was alive, but the man they pulled out of that cursed house was completely broken. The medics strapped him to a gurney in a heavy canvas straitjacket. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He just stared into the empty sky, his lips moving silently, whispering to the thousands of dead, rotting voices still trapped inside his shattered mind. It has been 7 years since we fled the mountain. Thomas and Lily are safe in Seattle. We never speak of the fog. We never speak of the screaming. Arthur is currently locked in the maximum security psychiatric wing of the state hospital. I visit him once a month. He sits in a padded white room, heavily sedated, staring at the walls. The doctors say his psychosis is permanent. They say his brain suffered a catastrophic, irreversible trauma. But I know the absolute horrifying truth. Arthur's mind isn't broken. It is a prison. Elias Blackwood is still in there, trapped beneath the heavy chemical sedatives, furious, starving, and waiting in the dark. As for Blackwood Manor, the bank never managed to sell it. It sits completely abandoned on the edge of the jagged cliff, slowly rotting under the suffocating gray fog of the Cascade Mountains. But it isn't empty. Sometimes, when the wind blows right through the valleys, the locals say they can hear a little girl crying in the upstairs window. And if you stand close enough to the rusted iron gates, you can feel the heavy, freezing dread of a house that is simply waiting for a new family to dream.